Hello and welcome to Optional Rule. My name is Scott. I am the host for this weekly D&D discussion show around all things D&D and gaming related. Thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate it. Today we're going to talk a lot about, actually that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the pain of lasting damage in 5th edition. Why lasting injury systems are so difficult to design. What are the factors people need out of them? What are the parts of the system that work against us? Maybe some of the perspective of history of lasting damage and how damage has been viewed in D&D. And I'm going to talk a little bit about options that I have a slew of options I've considered. I do a lot of theory crafting over time. I have a lot of notes, so you can see I have some thoughts on this topic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But first of all and foremost, this is a show about raising people's discussion level of discussion about D&D and helping them run actual games at their table. So if you have observations, if you have thoughts, if you have play styles or anything, please go ahead and add that in the chat below. I really love to hear what you're thinking about it, and especially how it works in your games or doesn't work. What are your observations there? Hey Sloops, how you doing? And eight Bitney, Fever Dream Studios, Nikki, Beholder to No One, Superior Guild, Guild Superior. Thank you very much for coming today. Actually, there's a couple of great creators. Let me start out with that in this chat right now. You might have seen some of them chatting down on the wall below. They are really fantastic. The Adventurers Guild, Guild Superior, I think, is the one associated with them. Hope for Tabletop Role Playing Games, same. I believe they're the same account or same associated account. Hope. I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong, but check them out on Twitter, check them out online. Really, really fantastic. Primo support for tabletop role-playing games of all kind. Fever Dream Studios, another great creator. Check them out on Twitch, check them out on Twitter. I've seen them do scenario design this week that really made me like, oh, that's really great. I almost switched the topic of today's show because they did such a great job. So please check them out. Nikki, Beholder to No One. Nikki is a great podcaster, amazing podcaster. So check out Beholder to No One podcast. They're really great. It's a discussion show, which is one of my favorite formats. I listen to it regularly. I really recommend that podcast. So go ahead and try those things out. And there's other people. If I'm not aware you're in chat and I haven't called you out, I apologize for that. Sloops 1103, thank you for coming. Go ahead and drop a link if you do some creation. I'd love to drop a link to Twitter or something like that. But it's great to have you. Anyway, there's a lot of great creators out there in the D&D space. We're all raising each other's level of sort of discussion. We all bring different experiences. That's why D&D discussions to me are so evergreen. There's such a complex network of your play style and your taste and the pacing of the game and everything else that this is an evergreen topic. How do you navigate all of the nuances of this? And I posted something a while ago that some people reacted negatively to because they thought it was too esoteric, but I still believe it. I think that the game isn't the game, that the game itself emerges from the interplay of all of these rule systems and player behaviors and player choices and the narration involved and the role playing, that the game itself is this emergent thing that comes out of this network of things that sort of come forward with out of those complex systems interacting. Anyway, that's how I think about it. So we're going to talk about that in depth today, actually. We'll talk a little bit about lasting injury systems. Knights of Bantam is Sloop 1103. I guess that's a podcast or something, but check that out. Give it a Google. I'll give it a Google after here. That's my back end of my website. You don't need to see that. First, I'll post something that I put up this weekend, last night, in fact. This is a tease for something that's coming in the weeks ahead. I have begun to parse the Great Monsters spreadsheet, which I'll let you know it's a resource you can find. There's a spreadsheet someone put together in Reddit where they tried to compile all of the list of monsters out there in D&D. And you can see the hit points, saving throws, skills, resistances, senses, all this different stuff. And I've begun to build a little set of scripts and where they're from. These are official sources. They're also homebrewed ones. I've begun to create a set of scripts that parses some of this down. I forget where the column for language is. It's a little dirty because a lot of these are entered by hand. I've made a copy of myself to clean up a bunch of things. But one of the first things I parsed out is like how many languages are listed in the monster manual that different monsters speak. How many stat blocks list that language as available from the from the monster itself. I thought it was a little interesting just because it helps players plan through like how common is this language with monsters. If I want to get into negotiations, what are some of the obscure languages when you get into a couple of when you get into like really obscure lore, would a language like primordial be written into it? Fever Dream Studios have found a couple of errors in that sheet. Go ahead and give me. Yeah, I have two. I've actually forked it. So the sheet I'm linking is the one that's on the official site because I don't want to claim credit for somebody else's work, but I've actually created a local copy and I've been creating those sheets and that in there, like the corrections as I've gone forward. So maybe before we get into talking about lasting injury, something I would love to see if a creator of D&D ever, I know you probably heard this a million times, but I am always appalled at the lack of data-driven and structured data resources available to the D&D community. Like I am appalled at this day and age that we don't have more digital resources to pull data from, to be able to analyze things that we want to know about the game, like how many monsters speak languages or what, there's so much dirty data out there because it has to be hand entered. I understand this proprietary stuff, but listen, dude, they're not going to, if you just publish stat blocks, it would be fine. No one's going to steal your IP. And I really wish it was out there in a structured way and authoritatively. By the way, world's greatest, okayest DM, lazy DM t-shirt, one of my new favorite t-shirts. It says, meh on the dice. Yeah, I really wish I had the more authoritative data sources to come from. They exist. It frustrates me because and I'll show you why in a second. I'm going to get a little bit into it, analytics about why I'm making some of the claims I'm making about long-term injuries and things like that. But all of this parsing is actually by way of, there was someone who asked a question on Twitter this week to inspire me to make a blog post about how do you balance spells and are things like damage resistance important. And I don't want to say off the cuff, I actually want to aggregate some data, like how often are monsters, do they have certain types of resistances, what types of damage spells are out there, where are the aggregations of bonuses for different saving throws for monsters. I want to actually derive that data to make something a little bit more authoritative, or at least have a reason why I'm saying what I'm saying about spell balance and whether damage types can change and things like that. But that's for a future show. I'm not going to do it today. Those are my but that's why I'm putting that together. So watch my blog. You're going to see a little bit about that in the coming weeks. Fever Dream Studio says this kind of database work is really cool. I think I agree. Although I would rather community efforts be concentrated on value add data rather than just getting basic data that already exists somewhere in some usable format. Now, I'm not saying I wish Wizards of the Coast published their narration blocks or special ability descriptions, but just the stat blocks itself, the data, like what are the bonuses for different monsters, what are their hit points. I wish that was published in a consumable format. So for any of you are tech heads, like a JSON format, like a document-based database would probably be the best way to go. Me having to parse out, what the different tags are, I can do it, but it's a little annoying. Anyway, I wish that existed. There's some neat things we can begin to tell about this. And it would be better to have, the community should already know things like who has what saving throw, how many monsters have resistance. That should be trivial for us to do. It would be great to have a value add. Like I intend to try to build some sort of system of ranking, like where does damage resistance kick in, and is there a relative value of how important it is? I'll build some algorithm to do that, but I'm at the early stages of it. I'll be working on that over time. Check that out. I just posted that last night. If that's interesting to you. Another stats one I'm going to talk about today is like mechanisms for affecting rolls, because that's going to come into long-term injury. So I had a post a while back. When was this? Back in right after the new year, I made this tools for what are the progressive set of tools for affecting rolls in D&D. Where does Bardic Inspiration come in the priority stack? Is it above or below Advantage? And actually, it's above. Certain types of it are. Is Guidance and Bless more impactful on a roll than something else? So this kind of analytics helps us sort of have a data-driven discussion about why we think design is better or harder, or what elements we're considering. I'm a very procedural type of person am I thinking? It's probably because I have a background in IT and software engineering, but I just am. I like to break down things into their atomistic parts and think about why, what impacts they have, why they are or aren't important, and have a reason for why I think things. Usually, I mean, I'm prone to bias like everybody else, but that's how I try to do it. All right, so let's talk about pain of lasting injury. Lasting injury systems. This is probably one of the most common. I keep looking at myself. I shouldn't do that. I'm going to cover myself up so I don't see me. The Giant Elk, yeah, Fever Dream Studios. Giant Elk is actually the most useful language. Why do you say it's most useful? It's obscure. That would be an interesting case. Like if a player came to me and said, I want to take, by the way, what they're referencing is, if you look in these languages, there's some deep speech, giant elk, giant eagle, ice toad is a separate language for some odd reason. I have no idea why. Yeah, it's really odd, but Otiagu is a language. You know, I guess you could get obscure if you wanted to take a super obscure language, but could a player speak these languages? Probably not. Do they have written components? I don't know. Probably not. Blink Dog, probably not a written language. Bullywug, maybe a written language. Could they intonate the sound some? It's a good question. It's something for DMs to ask. Could they understand it? Yeah, probably. Yeah, you're just joking because it was so obscure. Yeah, that's totally true. And a big plug for data-driven discussions. I agree. So, all right, so let's get down to the pain of lasting damage systems. So back to that. So damage systems are easily one of the most talked about topics that I see in Reddit, I see on Facebook, I see online and Twitter. People are looking often for a gritty system that has some sort of, where injuries are less, have some sort of meaning, that it's not just a trade of hit points. And the two main things that really people seem to complain about are, one, that injuries themselves don't carry any impact. Like you're just kind of losing hit points until the point that you get to zero, and then you're just unconscious. And there's no middle ground. It's just completely effective and completely going around, you're doing everything without impact, or you're unconscious and down and defeated. So that's one rub that people often talk about. And the other is the hit point recovery system. That is that you over at a long rest, you gain all of your hit points back. The hit dice, I'll get into that in a minute. That is not a used rule. It's not a rule I've seen anybody use. But you basically you get into an intense fight. You might fall to 0 hit points or negative hit points, or no negative hit points, but you fall to 0 hit points, fail a bunch of death saves, and you get an 8-hour sleep, and you just wake up good as new. No lasting injuries. And now that's neither good or bad. It's just, that's the game. And people chafe against that. So there's always this loop around that people want to get to some sort of system that makes injuries more meaningful. Now, meaning, I'm going to get into that. Why long-term injury? What does meaning mean? That, I think you're going to find a lot of drift. Yeah, they meaning to an injury, that especially that has a big difference between what a game master wants out of that and what a player wants out of that. So before I get into a design discussion, I'm primarily a DM. I try to stay engaged in playing a few of the folks on this stream today. I've had the honor of playing in some of your stream games or regular games, and it's been great. But I'm primarily a DM, and one of the things I always try to caution myself with are, when I come up with a rule, is this something I like the thought of somebody else doing, or is this something they would actually like to do? That's a gate, I believe. All DM rulings have to pass through before you make it a part of your gate, because DMs and players perceive things much differently. The player might see it as a burden. They might see it as something that's just annoying, that doesn't really key into their gameplay concerns. Those are all legitimate, and the game master is imagining the players feel some kind of way about it that they actually don't. That is a huge mismatch in many, many, many house rules between DMs and what they think is a good idea, and players and what they enjoy doing. And I can say, even as a player, when I play, I take the loss of hit points way differently than when I am a DM giving hit points out to damage out to a character. When I as a DM distribute damage to a player, my thought is, okay, they have half their hit points back, they're fine. But when I'm a player, I think, oh my God, I only have half my hit points left. And if you spend some effort into trying to keep those two things, like playing and DMing, you'll probably notice that in your own play. Anyway, so that's just a caution of when designing rules. So why do people want long-term injuries? So sometimes they want things like a narrative through line. In other words, they want that consistent gameplay of getting beat up. They want that Indiana Jones experience where Indy is just super, super beat up and scarred and just trudging through the whole thing. Throughout all of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, he's getting progressively worn down. Do hit points do that? I don't know. Would a penalty system do that? I don't know. I don't actually know what that means. But narratively, people are looking for this continuity that connects the reality players are living in to the world, to the action that they've been banking this whole time. Another thing people often look for out of this is resource management or choices or survival gameplay. That is that's where my attraction to this lies. I like resource management. I like things like that. I like narrative through lines too. I like most of this, but that I will say that is underappreciated in D&D itself. Many people sort of dismiss that because they don't know what it means. But I will say, if you look at the video game space, survival games are one of the big genres out there. So obviously there's an appeal about managing resources and stuff. That's why I have two sub bullets here. There's some implication that there's something built around that. It's not just you losing hit points. There's an implication that there's lots of player management options. In other words, the players have lots of agency to make choices, to make a game, to manage their injuries, to mitigate for the damage or the drawbacks they might suffer, and things like that. And then there's the assumption that's the gateway to more gameplay, so that if you're injured and you can't take a lot more combat, that you're not just going home, that you're not just saying, okay, well, we got nothing to do today, we can't get into another fight. The implication is that you're opening windows to, okay, I'm going to go do foraging, and that's meaningful in some way that is not currently exist in D&D. Or I'm going to actually give medical care to this player and let them rest, or find a shelter that's safe and secure, or do all of this. That is a gateway to other forms of acquiring more resources, managing those resources, making decisions through your environment, things like that. That's an implication in all of that. So I wish people would be less prone to dismissing that thought, that thinking. The other is consequences. I less buy into this, but I know that's what people talk about this all the time, so I want to bring it up. In other words, they want a consequence for losing. They want a consequence for choosing to get into a fight. They want consequences that persist with the player throughout their experience, right? That stays with them. The other is just narrative. This is a play on narrative throughput, increased danger. They want that grim, dark scenario where there's this constant fear of danger and what's sort of happening with them in the world, and this tension. I will say that's a very keen area for a difference between the way the DM perceives something and the player. There's a fine line to creating mood with mechanics that I think you really need to appreciate as it comes to damage. That where the DM thinks, aha, you're almost on the verge of being defeated, you should feel tense. The players may not always feel that way, because there's a point past which that the players feel like they have no choice. They're just going along with whatever dice rolls are happening, with whatever the system the DM is set in place is. And so they sort of shrug and they go, okay, well, you tell me when I can do something. And they sort of check out. So that is an extremely difficult line to work for systems design when it comes to long-term injury, especially in D&D, which is not designed for that. And then the other thing they're often looking for out of a long-term injury is toughness or gameplay reality. In other words, if you want to play a fighter who's a tough character, hit points doesn't often do that. Can you shrug off injury? Can you ignore it? Can you push through? Can you can you make a statement that I'm a tough guy or girl, really, or non-binary, and I'm putting myself at risk here to do something for you, that I'm really putting myself out there with this. Is that a part of your gameplay? And lasting injury systems people are often looking to those for that. Now, this is probably not a comprehensive list. These are the main ones I could think of. If you can think of another reason why someone might like it, go ahead and drop it down in the comments, either now in the chat or later if you're seeing this on YouTube or something like that. But go ahead and give it a shot. So that's why. Your players are all different. And the thing, I'm going to get into things, by the way, what I'm going to talk about here, I want to set up why people like it, so we can establish that there's a legit reason why what people are looking for out of that, what those might be. I'm going to talk about things to overcome, which are there's reasons why D&D lasting injury systems don't work that I see. They fail one of these gates that they're mitigating for. And then what tools are available if we were going to examine a lasting injury system? What might we use? So let's talk about things to overcome. How does the system itself work against you in D&D? Because one of the interesting things about 5th edition D&D, to me, it's the tightest design system ever, tightest design edition of D&D. In other words, the systems interplay back and forth very well. They dovetail very well with each other. But the problem is, once you change one system, it has this sort of cascading impact across all of D&D design you have to be conscious of. So first thing to overcome, that is a wound system that's a change without a change. And I'm going to insult something that's in the book, so sorry about this if you use it. But the lasting difference, there's a gritty realism rules in the DMG. It's an optional rule you can use, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but it basically just extends out the rest period. That you get one short rest per day, and you get one long rest per week. In other words, you recover. Now your injuries basically stay with you over the course of a week, and at the end of a week, you just heal up completely. And your short rest it gets extended out through the week. Fever Dream Studios, by the way, I really like the perspective of having the injuries open up interactions for the player. I absolutely agree. By the way, I want to point out, I'll get to it a little bit later, but there's the Adventures in Middle-earth role-playing game. It's out of print now. If you can find a PDF copy of it, grab it. Now, it's not a lasting injury system, but they have a survival system and a sort of a group-based engagement with the environment and travel that is just the best I've ever seen. It's really thoughtful. It has some potential for D&D, but it doesn't quite fit. I'll do something on that in the future. But anyway, if you want an example of like this great system, go ahead and check that out. All right, and it creates a lot of interactions between players. So change without a change. The gritty realism thing. It just extends out the healing. It doesn't change it. It just says narratively, well, you only recover fully once per week, and the short rest you might recover during the week gives you a little bit of buffer of how many hit points you can recover. But it doesn't really change anything. It just extends it out over a longer period of time. Plus, there's the issue of short rest abilities coming back and long rest abilities coming back and so forth. So the truth is, it feels like a difference, but all you're doing is saying you just have to fight less often as a player. It's not really raising the stakes. It's not, to me, addressing one of these core issues of what people are looking for. They're not managing injuries. There's no way to get back more hit points during that week through management. Maybe it's increased danger, but it's taking the agency away from the player. Once they've lost hit points, if they don't have options to get it back, who really cares? So to me, the major problem with the gritty realism system is it's a change without a change. It just slows down. So instead of saying an hour passes between encounters, you're saying a day passes. Who cares, right? What real difference does it make? And it forces a change on the game master that now I have to like not put encounters close to one another. I do a bunch of stuff that it adds a lot of annoyance to me as a game master. It doesn't add anything to the game, and it doesn't solve one of these things that I'm looking for out of a lasting injury system. The other thing to overcome is adding complexity to the game. We'll get into the tools available, but often that's going to be a problem with these. Like you have to keep track of hit die recovery, or you have to keep track of like a slower hit point recovery, or you reduce your maximum hit points, or all of the different things or you have to now add up different bonuses in different contexts, or add additional rolls, and just there can be a lot of complexity addition to the game. Then I actually think that's a big problem. Now, I personally don't mind that. I kind of enjoy adding complexity to a game, but most players don't. And sometimes I'm just looking to roll some bones and have a good time. Now, this is the big one that I don't think people appreciate, especially if you have not played previous editions of D&D. That's player as healbot. Something to understand about earlier editions of D&D is the cleric was always considered the kind of the crap job. in the game, especially in first and second edition. You were sort of a cleric. Your role there was to wait to either heal people during combat or heal them when they rested overnight, because there was no long rest mechanic. There was no short rest mechanic. You recovered a couple of hit points per day. So what people who played cleric, someone would go, okay, I'll play the cleric. And what they would do is they had all these spell slots and all these abilities, but the truth is they never used them. All they did was hold on to their spell slots because they wanted to heal the players either during combat or at night when you went to rest so they could come up at full ability. So this is really the genius of 5e. What it said is, I don't want clerics to feel put on. I don't want clerics to just be a heal bot. I want them to use all these other cool abilities in the encounter. I want them to be as full a member of an adventuring party as any other member. And I actually think that's one of the number one things that is difficult to overcome. So when you come up with these injury systems, there's almost always going to be a spell, which I'll get into the next bullet in a second. Always a spell that lets you overcome that. So the cleric is just going to hold on to those slots so they can cast them at night, and now they're basically taken out of the encounter. And that's not a great play style for a lot of players. So 5th edition did that I think that's why they came up with the long rest mechanic, because they wanted to bring clerics back into the party as an adventuring partner and not just as a heal bot. The other is canceling rules. This is a design that this is probably the second biggest problem with rules as I see them. Many rules that people come up with for gritty realism or injuries or survival mechanics especially, they'll throw this rule out there that's very dangerous, that can really have a big impact on a party, and then they'll immediately throw in a rule that says, yes, but if you do this, none of that matters. So it's this rock, paper, scissors version, and that's a design problem in D&D. The winter survival rules in Rime and the Frost Maiden is a clear example of this. They have all these mechanics around freezing to death and exhaustion and all this stuff, but if you wear winter clothes, none of that matters. So why bother with it? I think that's what. So if you create this elaborate injury system, and you have player as a heal bot who can just cast spells to get rid of it, why did any of that matter to begin with? I would say it doesn't generally. So therein lies a problem. Then there's I want to get through this because I want to talk about the tools available. There's a death spiral. In other words, as you get hurt, you fail and get hurt, which gives you a penalty, which makes you fail more often, which makes you get hurt more often, and this is just a spiral, negative feedback loop where you just fail more often, get injured more often, and you get injured and defeated more easily. The other is a bounded accuracy problem. Like a core element of the design of 5th edition D&D is this concept of bounded accuracy. In other words, you only have a small slice of bonuses that you are expected to have at a certain level, and start removing a -1 or -2 or something else that you might do from an injury system. The impact gets way out of whack with what the intended design for combat for the system. So it has a bigger impact than you would imagine. The other is burst damage as a core element of design in the PC arms race. There's no way around this. It's just that, if you take on some system like telling players they can't recover hit points as often or do something else like this, the game is designed that players are usually close to full when they get into combat. Not always, but close to it, or they can at least recover it back quickly, or often at full hit points. So therefore, there's this massive burst damage in 5th edition that did not exist in previous editions. That, dragons are doing 45 points of damage on a breath weapon, or players are burst damaging. So you have this crazy burst damage. So reducing the number of hit points available not only make it more likely they'll get defeated, but maybe die from a critical injury, like a massive damage injury. Now, there's a reason why in early editions of D&D, things felt a little bit more close to the line. And that's because the burst damage was way less, hit points were way less. You did more of this incremental progress towards defeat or victory rather than a 2 or 3 rounds and the whole thing was over. And just as a comparison, I put in here, like a Beholder in AD&D had around 50 hit points. That's it. A Bugbear had about 15 hit points. A Black Dragon, for instance, 35 hit points, roundabout, right? And their own damage was they had 3 attacks, 2 of them were D4 and 1 was a D8. That's not a lot of damage. And so the margins that you can have a mistake and just a bad roll were way, way, way less. So that's a big thing you have to overcome in your system. And then the idea that you're lacking the tools for a robust system of managing health and treatment. So going up to this piece of resource management, survival gameplay. If you do something in here and you want something out of it, you can't just take hit points away without really risking a game collapse. You have to add in a bunch of systems that allow you to manage that much, much better depending on the mechanism you choose. And so that basically requires a rewrite of some existing systems, or or just adding a bunch of new systems, and that's a much more complex endeavor than people give it credit for. All right, so let's talk. We got a half hour here. Let's talk about the tools available. So, yeah. I'm not going to cover gritty realism because it's published in the book. It's a fine tool. Go ahead and use that if you want. But like I said, I can tell you it doesn't pass through that gate of being a change without a change. It doesn't satisfy that for me. All it does is slow down the pace of the game and add nothing to it. So I'm not going to cover it here. I've noodled on all of these different options for lasting injury systems. I'm going to actually talk about one I actually use that, in retrospect, I wish I hadn't, but I'm using it right now. And then some other options I've considered too. So the first is exhaustion. So I see this out frequently as a house rule. It's a house rule in my game that you get a level of exhaustion if you go to 0 hit points and fail a death save. You only get one level of exhaustion, so you can't get multiple levels of exhaustion if you fail multiple death saves in a single downing. But it is possible if you go down 0 hit points, fail a death save, someone heals you, you come right back up, and you go down again, fail another death save, you can get another level of exhaustion. It's never really worked out that way, but it can. Now, that is supposed to, in my world, give you some holdover without it being earth-shattering for the player. So how does it actually work at the table? I think it makes almost no difference, to be honest. And that's why I'm saying I'm regretting including it, because there's two things that happen. One, too complex. So it's already passing by this too complex rule of the game. And I guess there should be another one about it not making any real difference. So the players are they get a level of exhaustion. They almost always forget that they get it. I forget that they get it because I've got a million other things that I'm balancing. And in the cases where they remember or where they've gotten it, it's always some big epic climax combat, and they almost always have a chance to rest after and recover their level of exhaustion. Additionally, I've added an additional option to recover a level of exhaustion. I'm not going to get into the rules here, but for one time a day, you can do something to try to recover additional level of exhaustion. So it's a cancellation. It's a canceling rule, right? It's a change without a change. It automatically cancel. You can rest and get rid of this thing I just had you acquire. So in retrospect, it's really not particularly effective. I could enter into a complex mechanism of getting more and more levels of exhaustion, but then there's two problems with that. First of all, it's this death spiral. So it's this death spiral game. So it doesn't pass that gate. And the other is there's only 6 levels of exhaustion. So if you add an ability to get multiple levels of exhaustion in a single combat, that with any likelihood, now you're tossing hit points out the window and saying, well, if this happens 6 times, you're just dead. Or basically by 3 times, you're in such a death spiral that it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So, and then it also goes against bounded accuracy and all of these other things. So I just don't see a great outcome for exhaustion as a long-term injury mechanic. Other is death penalty or direct penalty. So in other words, you just say, okay, you're injured, and whatever threshold. You can say if you're bloodied, or you're at 10% of your hit points, or went to -1 once, you just have a -1 penalty. This is where there's tools that affect rolls come in. Let me increase the size here. Font. You could use any of these, sure. You have to get into combat, but like Bane, like a -D4, a -1 is not often rolled in there. Those are things you can add. Disadvantage is pretty powerful. Once you get into disadvantage and everything, you're struggling uphill as a player character. I don't really understand what benefit you'd end up in a death spiral. So I don't see the potential. Excuse me, I'm on the wrong page. I don't see the potential in a direct penalty. And really, what's the agency of the player? I think you'd need to add something in where they could mitigate for it through some circumstance. But then you're in a cancellation loop back, right? So what's the point of having it? Again, what would the point of adding that complexity to be to the game if you can cancel it? I don't know. The other you consider is can consider is like movement and action penalties. Um, this might be okay. You're at half movement. You're at half. You like you lose your bonus action or you lose your reaction. Those are all possibilities. I don't think they're great because one, movement isn't that big of a deal, and two, actions are too big of a deal. Everything, like especially since players variably rely on their different action economy. Action economy is everything in fifth edition. I don't think that's a great option for a DM. If you think differently, though, go ahead and post it down in chat. But I don't see that as a potential area. So the other is ability score loss. I actually think this has some potential. I considered writing up a house rule. Now, probably when I write this blog post, I might write something about this. But there's an option that you could put in where you take an ability, some sort of ability loss. Traveler has a system like this where you begin to lose stat values as you get injured, and you spread them across your physical stats. So the equivalent of D&D would be you lose some die damage for some. Came up with a system where you lose some attribute points that recovers slowly, and you get to choose as a player, does it come off strength, dex, or con, and you suffer the appropriate penalties for that as time goes on. And if you're down one stat and you lose points from another stat, that can't recover without some long-term mechanic. I think it's way too complex. The players would start having to figure out, well, what's my new modifier now, and how does that apply to a role? I've had some people come up with that. I just don't think it has any good potential in D&D because it's too complex to keep track of. It requires whole new systems, and I don't really think there's something here. These are, by the way, orders of increasing probability that I might adopt a rule like this. So I think all of these are just out for me because even though I'm using one of them actively currently, I think it's out for me because it doesn't create anything interesting. It doesn't add to the game. It's overcome immediately, or the complexity it might add doesn't do a whole lot for a game. All right, so the two fertile grounds for me for long-term injury is based on hit points. I don't think a penalty really helps. I don't think something that gets too specific helps because of the added complexity and cancellation rules. Oh, by the way, I want to say somebody will probably ask at some point, well, what about hit location rules like losing an eye or having permanent injuries like that? I think there is a table in like that. I haven't even included in this because I think that's a horrible idea for two reasons. One, first of all, D&D is not a combat simulation. It is not. It's never meant to be. It's not a simulationist game. Now, that doesn't mean it's free from being reasonable or rational. That's not the same thing. It just means that a hit point is not supposed to map to a cut or a specific type of injury. You're not supposed to lose a hand and have that map to a specific negative. You're not doing that in D&D. That's not what D&D is built to do. So I think one, that's a problem. Two, the other problem is over time, you take so much damage as a PC. If you went to a 10th level campaign or God forbid 20th, you would be whittled down to a tiny little nub. You'd just be a detached head sitting in a helmet with feet sitting out, poking out of the bottom. That's what you'd be reduced to. And that, again, what's the utility of that in a game? And if you didn't do that, that means you have some mechanism to overcome it in the system, which we're back to. You just have something that cancels that out. Why bother? Why bother doing that if you're just going to be in a constant cycle of letting it happen to the players and undoing it, letting it happen to the players and undoing it? Maybe interesting as a one-time or two-time narrative device, but once you're doing that as your standard mechanism for managing your wounds in a game, where's the interest? What's the addition to the game, I would ask. So that's why I don't even include it on the list. I think just on the face of it, it's not great. All right. So the two, I think, mechanisms that are ripe for potential of long-term injury are, instead of giving someone maximum hit points or telling them to recover slowly, you can reduce the maximum amount of hit points that they have available to them to recover too. So that's one. The other is hit dice. I think this is underappreciated. This is the one I tend to think if I did a system for, I would focus on hit dice. An sometime unknown or unappreciated rule in D&D is you have this when you do roll hit dice to recover for a short rest. You only have a certain number of hit dice. It's the number of hit dice your character currently has, and you actually, over a long rest, you only recover by the rules as written. You only recover half of those hit die. So if you've gone through this is current system. If you go through an adventure in a day, you take a short rest or a couple of short rests, you spend all of your hit dice on recovering during that day. You get injured some more, you recover on a long rest that night, you wake up with all of your hit points back, but only half of your hit dice are recovered. So when you enter a short rest the next day, you only have half of your hit dice to roll for a short rest. Nobody uses it. I've never met anybody who actually uses that rule. So that creates a problem. Fever Dream Studio was saying you have to wait to 13th level before you can start regrowing things. Yeah, that's true. But again, what's the point of the injury? You're going to be most games don't last the 13th level. So most games you'd be whittled down to a nub, and then at some point it just becomes not a problem. Yeah, I just don't think it adds anything to the game. Fever Dream Studio says, I do think if you're adding these negative takeaway rules, you'd have something to balance it out. Yeah, that's it. That's absolutely true. That's a hard, as I said earlier, though, that's a hard line to walk because if it completely negates the negative elements you brought in, what's the point of having it? Because players will do that every time. So you want to have enough of the drawback holding on to feel like something is happening, but not so much that it creates a negative feedback loop. Yeah, that's I think what you have to balance. So anyway, I just explained how hit die work. I'll get to that in a second, but I want to talk about max hit point reduction. So that is something you can think about. There's lots of different ways I've thought about doing this. So if you look at a game like Divinity Original Sin, what that does is it has a hit point mechanic. Your hit points get reduced over time, but you get these small increments as every time you take some damage, you have a small lasting injury threshold that starts building up, which says your maximum hit points now can't come above a certain level. It starts reducing from the ceiling your hit points can be. That's a decent mechanic, actually. I actually don't mind that. I would probably do something like every time you're reduced to a 0 hit points, you'd roll like half of a hit die to see how many points you lose off the maximum hit points. And over time, you'd have to have some separate long rest mechanic that lets you recover those lost maximum threshold points. I think that actually has some benefit for the game. There's a couple of other video games that do that. But that's one of my first clues as to maybe why this isn't great. Do you want to create a separate stack of hit points you need or damage you need to track? That's not egregious, but it is a separate level of complexity. And the other is I've only ever seen it done in video games, which tells me someone thinks they need a computer to manage this. So is that really useful? And would the player really care about that? I don't know. So I think the mechanic there would be every time you go down to 0 hit points, you roll like a half of one of your hit die. You lose that off your maximum hit points. So the more you go down, the more your max you lose off your max. A critical element here is not to include a spell or something magical that lets you do away with that. That's because now you're getting around the cancellation of the problem in the first place. So why have it? So you need some other mechanic looped in, whether that be bed rest and a player can use their medicine skill to give you something, or herbs, and that maybe there's a roll to recover a certain number of these hit points per day, and that affects the roll. But you really have to have some system that you lose a little bit off the maximum number of hit points you can recover to. So your ceiling of hit points now gets lower and lower and lower. So if you're exhausting yourself, you're just getting worn down. It has to be small, so it can't just get this burst damage where now you're just out of action forever, and then you're in the middle of a module wondering about, well, how do we take a month off to let this person heal? You'd have to create a system that can let you recover those similar small amounts over time. So it has to be a progressive system that can either accelerate or decelerate based on player actions. That gives them some agency, but doesn't totally cancel it out. I think that's a viable system. The other is every time you roll, and I've thought about this. This is another rule. I'd love to hear your take on it. Whenever you roll to recover hit points in a short rest, first of all, in these systems, I would love to. I think it's great to move to a system where you don't recover all hit points overnight. You only ever roll your hit dice to recover hit points, even during a long rest. And maybe you get some kind of bonus in a long rest. So let's say you can recover hit points by spending your hit die to recover your injuries during a short rest like normal. And in a long rest, you roll the same dice, you get a +1 per die to actually recover. So that the long rest mechanic is better. Maybe say you lose that if you don't have a tent or some survival element. And any damage you haven't healed by the next day is your maximum threshold. So you have 50 hit points and 5 hit die, let's say. You roll your 5 hit die, you get 45 hit points recovered. You have 5 points now of lasting injury. Now, that's a possibility, but there's a lot of variability in there because you could roll really poorly, and that could be a problem. Guild Superior said they like that. I like it too. Here's my mitigation. I have to think more about that. But so what happens if you spent all your hit die to do a recovery, or you choose to spend 1 hit die? I don't know. There's a lot of scenarios by which you can take a ton of damage. Like you haven't recovered all your hit die in a rest, or you have spent all your hit die, but you go into the evening rest with still injuries. Do you retain those the next day? I'd have to come up with something that, players might freak out. I'd have to come up with something where you take a few injury points based on healing. Now, maybe that's just, instead you use something like if you roll a 1 on your hit die, every one you roll is, you take 1 of your own hit die of maximum injury points. There's some play in there to be had, but it's not quite clear. And I'm not going to completely flesh it out today, but I have thought of that. Now, what is appealing about this for me? One, if you keep this incremental back and forth of a few your ceiling coming down slowly and being able to bring it back up slowly, that gives you something to manage in between encounters. Specifically, I'll point to it we had a couple of months ago, one of our encounters was a knockout drag-out fight. One of these players just got mauled by a tiger, a Siberian tiger, like mauled, shook in their mouth, the whole bit like that. 0 hit points. The players immediately rested in the location they had to fight, and they wake up the next morning, hey guys, that was a tough fight, huh? And even the player was like, that's weird. I just got mauled by a tiger, and now I'm dancing. Yeah, that was weird. But if they woke up instead of like, I just can't get rid of these last 5 hit points, really, really holding on, that might be something that would mean something to them. Anyway, So now that's below the next one I'm about to go to. So I'm down to about 15 minutes. So let's talk about that, because I feel like this hit die mechanic has the most potential for me in my mind. It's similar to the maximum hit points, but instead it moves the system off into how many resources do you have to recover hit points at all. So if I go to hit die, in other words, the core of this system assumes a couple of things. What I said before still applies. You always roll recovery. So there is no, I recover all of my hit dice over, all of my hit points over on a long rest. There is none of that. By the way, everything else stays the same. All your ability recharges, everything else like that would stay the same in short and long rest. It's your hit point recovery that changes. So there's no more, I recover all my hit points at a long rest. You always have to roll your character's hit dice to recover. The difference here is during a short rest, you can recover your hit dice normally. During a long rest, if you spend hit dice, you have to spend hit dice over a long rest. See, if you've held on to them to recover at a long rest, assuming you have things like a comfortable place to sleep and a few other things like that, you can get some bonus to that hit die recovery roll. You might get a 1 if you have a +1 if you have a tent available, a +1 if somebody does a medical check for a maximum, and these add up. But it's not super, super significant. It's just these little increments. So you're always rolling hit point recovery. And then the separate mechanism is that how many hit dice you recover to that pool. That's the long-term injury mechanic. I'll tell you what my hesitancy is to that in a second, but right now you just get rid of this rule that you recover all of them, half of your hit dice per long rest. Or at least you include it on it. Go down to something like half of your maximum hit die or a quarter, or you start out with 1 hit dice that you recover, and you can begin to do things to recover more of these hit dice. Have a great meal. So we're going back to this Ventures in Middle Earth. survival system. What I like about the Adventures in Middle Earth, excuse me, I'm banging my desk here. What I like about the Adventures in Middle Earth role playing system is it creates these roles during travel where you get different types of, like, someone can be a cook and someone could be a guard and someone could be a scout and someone could be a navigator. And I like that idea. Likewise, in camp, I love this idea of creating like maybe someone's a cook. And if they cook a great meal or they have a role, everybody there gets they recover an extra hit dice back to their recovery pool. If someone is a doctor, they do something with medical skill or herbs or something like that, the whole party gets another hit dice. They have to roll a skill, and it's all skill check based, so it's a little bit variable. The ranger might set up tents, use a survival check to set everybody's tents up really well. And if they don't roll it well, and that roll might be harder based in bad weather, they lose out. They might be able to recover another hit die. So there are options that I think are interesting that we can do around this hit die recovery mechanic. I like that better than the gritty mechanic because it keeps the pace of short rest abilities and long rest abilities. It mostly keeps pace with the number of encounters you can have per day. It does build up over time. Like after a few days and you're not recovering your hit die, you might need to call a break and go take a longer rest. I like that too. And it doesn't immediately lower your threshold. Like over time, you would recover less and less hit points, and you would depend on the player being a heal bot, but that builds up slowly, as opposed to just saying, okay, we had one bad fight, now you're the heal bot, now we have to rest 4 days. That's something that gives you a buffer. You need a buffer between the middle scenario. You need a buffer between the starting of a failure cycle and the worst case scenario. You need a buffer in there. And to me, this provides a buffer. I'd have to do a lot of work in here around, how do you handle it when it's 1 hit die characters versus 10 hit die characters? How do you handle if it's added hit die, none of that really becomes relevant until you get to 5th level. Like at 1st level, there's an irony here because all of this care doesn't really matter at 1st level because you only have 1 hit die to recover. But maybe the plus to recovery, maybe that's enough. So I don't want to create a longer mechanic for players who are higher level, right? So yeah, that's a challenge of that. I mean, I could do things like tell people they have to roll to recover a hit die per night. There's some kind of roll, constitution roll, but that gets to be too complex. But yeah, so these are the things why I've never published a house rule for a long-term injury system, because I think it's just the system works against you in too many ways. I think I might try to do it based on this hit die system. But it's never occurred to me. It's never really sparked me in such an insightful way to say, this is the way to go, because there's too many things to balance to move forward for. So I think, that just becomes something that, why would I do this? What is, and all of this, what's the player getting out of it? I don't think the player cares about, I have 3 hit dice to roll for recovery or 2 hit dice. I don't think that's not the thing they care about. The thing they care about is, what could I have done to avoid that? Or what can I do to get something back? That's what they care about. They don't care once they're at the number of, you've lost this many hit dice, or you've lost this many hit points or at least over a long term. The player doesn't have anything they can do about that. They're just like, okay, well, that sucks for me. I guess I'm going to sit here in this cave and wait until it passes. So you end up with this feedback loop to the story as well. Players start to turtle up. If it's too harsh, players start to turtle up. Players start to get reluctant to take risks. That's not something you want to foster in your group, but having some buffer, like, another option I've thought about the hit die recovery is, it's not hit dice. It's a negative that you roll per hit die to recover. This is something that I sort of like, that a sort of a light injury, you're -1 now to recover your hit die. You're -2 every time you roll a hit die. When that progresses 3, 4, and that this is something that maybe like a week long epic rest to come up with something else that removes a level. Once you're at -6, right? You've probably got some serious injury. You're not able to recover. I actually like that quite a bit because that scales with the player hit die system. Matter of fact, I like it so much, I'm going to take a note for myself. -1. The other, I could put them per per injury level or long-term injury level. Laying it on each hit dice, 8d for recovery per injury level, epic injury level. I like that. The other thing I could do is, again, looking at this system of rolls, you can make it variable. One downside of that is that it could be, it's too deterministic, right? 1, 2. Alternatively, what I could do is I could roll a counter roll, which is like I roll at a certain injury level, you lose a D4 per, I think this is too complex, but I'll just say it for completeness. You lose a D4 at a certain injury level off of your hit die. And that progresses to a D6 and to a D8. I don't like that because it's too rough. That's just way too rough. But you could do something like that. You could do something like disadvantage. You roll disadvantage on your hit die recovery roll. And I'll just say it right out. I think that's too powerful. I think that's too powerful. Like you roll 2 die and you have to take the lowest one every time you recover. You'd have to break up the rolls between your multiple rolls if you have multiple hit die. But I actually like this idea of a -1. You have to always roll hit die recovery. In these rules, so here's the rules as so suggested rule. You guys are helping me think through this. I talked with Fever Dream Studio about rubber ducky debugging, and I'm doing that right here. So idea. Where do you get the -1? Someone has an idea. Go ahead and post it in chat. But so let's say every time you go to 0 hit points in a day, maybe in a day, I don't know, maybe a day's too much. Actually, I don't like 0 hit points. Every time you fail a death save, you get -1. You get an epic injury level. We'll call it epic for now because I like epic injury level. Every epic injury level gives you -1 on hit die recovery, on a hit die recovery roll. Dice, yeah, on a hit die when rolling recovery. It's supposed to be 1 per die, right? And what else is so also the assumption is you always roll hit die recovery, always roll recovery. This keeps the mechanism where you get half of your hit dice back per long rest. I actually like that because it changes less of the system. It's this epic level of injury building up over time. What's the recovery though? Boy, I don't know. We have to come up with a mechanism for medicine. Medicine? You roll per day to recover a level. Or per week. Is it per day or per week? What do you think? Oh, sorry, burping here. It's a Fever Dream Studio. Is there like a wound system where it works like exhaustion? You've seen that you like. I haven't, and I'll tell you, I haven't because it creates that death spiral. That's what I don't like about it. I also haven't seen enough tools built up around it. People will just throw out a table and a small thing. So this whole thing of added complexity, tools. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the exhaustion rules because it's weird how they do. Ability bonus versus attack bonus. It's just weird. And only having those 6 levels, I haven't seen one. That doesn't mean it's bad. I haven't seen one that I like. And again, what are you managing? Like just giving someone a negative isn't my goal here. I'm trying to create a dynamic where the players can manage more of their environment to deal with that mechanic over time. I like this because it gives them a little bit more choice. It builds up over time. Scales with the system. Yeah, like medicine per day, you're asking. Roll per day. Medicine? What would it be? Well, I'm wondering about that. Roll per day. It'd either be a straight up con roll. So, like, you have to account for cases where it's a lone person laying there by themselves with no treatment. Con roll or substitute a medicine roll. And what's the DC? How would we set the DC for this? That's an interesting question. So there's a couple ways you can set DC. You can scale the injury. So you can say it's related to how injured you are. You could say it's just flat 10. People do that quite often, right? It's 10 and that's it. Or 15. I like 15 to tell you the truth. So it depends on how often you want it to happen. If I was doing it per day, I'd want to do roll per day at DC 15. And why? Why do I want that? Because you're going to fail less, right? If you're rolling per day at DC 10, it's just too easy to recover. I think. I don't know if that's true or not. I'd have to play test that. Or DC 10 per week, right? Yeah. Yeah, perhaps greater. Hey, Kyle, how you doing? Make medicine particularly useful. Yeah, I like that too. And then herbs could do something. I create a system of herbs where it gives you a bonus to that roll or something. Fever Dream Studios, perhaps greater restoration can remove a level of this penalty. Aha! I understand the sentiment there, but then it's just your player's back to being heal bot. Now they're wasting every time someone has one of these injuries. There's pressure under them to that cleric to save those spell slots to cast greater restoration on players. They're turning them back into a heal bot, and again, I'm providing you with something that just removes it like that. So why am I bothering with this whole system? I do think it's a genius to 5th edition why they designed that, because most of these come around to like, why are we bothering with this? I can just get rid of it with this ability, or why, or it disappears after 2nd or 3rd level, or it just turns a player into a heal. But those are the big ones, man. They're really hard to overcome in this system design. But I like this. I'm going to flesh this idea out. I think a day or a week, I wish I had more options, maybe every other day, or maybe something like that. But I like the option of, so what this does is essentially does what I said before, which it reduces your ceiling of your hit points, because you're only going to be able to recover so many hit points over time. Then it builds up slowly over time as well. You just have to deal with that lasting injury. And since if you get a multiple break, like you're not dead. Let's say if you're fighting day after day after day or after day and spending all your hit dice for recovery, this is an issue, right? But if you just had one big fight in one day, even if you had a -1 to the recovery, you're going to recover all your hit points by the 2nd day at least, right? So it's really only something that comes into play if you're doing it over time, which makes me wonder, how often will this actually come up in play? Because if it doesn't come off, frequently enough, and it's not fun, who cares, right? What was really around there? I could also set DC. I could set DC set by conditions, right? So I could do something like the DC 20 if you're alone, like hiding under a bush somewhere in bad weather. DC 15, if you have a shelter in bad weather. DC 10 if you're in like a hospital or long-term care, something like that. Yeah, your Fever Dream was saying, greater restoration removes exhaustion as well. Perhaps I'm thinking too much along the lines of exhaustion. I don't know, maybe not. And you're right, it does. Greater restoration requires a diamond. Yeah, that's possible. I'd have to play test the system, which I might do if I ever get a workshop group together. But yeah, anyway, those are my ideas of why. I mean, I did a lot of meandering here, but these are my thoughts of why do long-term injury systems kind of not work in D&D. The system's just not designed for it. There's always this part of me of like, why am I bothering with this? I haven't added anything that I think is fun. And sometimes when I do, it's just really what the game master thinks it's fun for the players to do. And the players are like, nah, I don't really care. So am I adding anything to the game? That's always a good question to ask with these house rules. But system matters. There's a great essay from, I think it's the 90s, the late 90s. It might be early 2000s, called System Matters. So system impacts people's perception of play and pacing of the game and what values they set for their actions and things like that. So they always, even in the most hardcore role-playing groups, system still matters. So people should think that through a little bit. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's show here. We're at about our hour, so I try to keep it. If you're joining me for the first time, thank you very much for showing up. I really appreciate it. I do this show every week at noon Saturday. So I hope you'll join me in future weeks. I do all kinds of D&D discussions. I hope you'll add to the discussion down on the tavern wall below. Comment on this on Facebook. Please, please, please do all the social media things. Share it, like it, subscribe, all those things. I'm on YouTube and Twitch. Follow me on Twitter. I'm very active there. Optional Rule on Twitter. And I publish a blog at optionalrule.com. This is going to be the thing I discussed today. This is going to be a blog post next week. So I'll help you do all the things. And really, the big thing that helps is please go ahead and share it on your social media. If you think this is interesting or useful, share things that you've heard, share the video itself. All those things really help the channel. I'm a small channel. I don't have a Patreon. I don't have, I'm not selling anything. I just do this because this is my hobby and I enjoy it, and I've been doing it for 40 years. So I hope you're running a game. I hope you're having fun. I really hope you found something useful in today's discussion. I hope you'll join me in future weeks. Thank you very much for showing up. I really appreciate all the shout outs. Thank you so much. And until next week, remember, fun is not optional. Thanks, everybody. You take care.
I feel